largely regarding the book Redeeming Sociology and sociology as a science, how that can be redeemed, how that can be reconciled with what we believe in Christianity, what we believe in theology, and our perspective and how we see the world as a Christian believer. So how do we, as Christians, take the scientific method? There's a lot of people who fear getting a vaccine, fear getting vaccinated. They're opposed to science, and I want to make a distinction between science and scientism, and also I want to make a difference between religious fanaticism and modern Christian understanding of science. Science is something that it proves the existence of God. Science necessarily does not have to always contradict with religious faith, with faith, with understanding of God, with theology. It goes hand in hand, I believe. Science has it's a train track that goes one toward the same idea, and another train track that goes the same idea of God. Science is a way of gathering facts, empirical data, and then making a conclusion out of that. Theology and understanding of God, study of God, is understanding revelation from God, conceptualizing what God has revealed to us about Himself. Unless we cannot know Him, there is a separation. There is a unknowability of God that we cannot understand Him, and we call that transcendence. He is transcendent. God is a transcendent being. There's a limit to what we know about Him. We cannot know everything about Him. Once we get to heaven, we'll start learning about Him more and more every day as we spend eternity in heaven. But it takes an eternity. So to say that science can somehow prove the existence of God, ultimately it does, and yet it's hard for us to see that the existence or understanding of God can have some kind of correlation with science. There was a lot of animosity between science and religion, and this reason and faith. That is why a lot of theologians, even in our patristic era, our early church fathers, mentioned this faith-seeking understanding. Faith and reason always was something that philosophers and thinkers, early church thinkers, thought they were one. And then with the Enlightenment era, faith and reason began to be split. And I believe that there needs to be another reconciliation between faith and reason, that it goes together, faith-seeking understanding. This is a very important topic. We are going to look at the following things: the scientific method of sociology. Before we go into that, this introduction, we want to just review and understand what we understood with this introduction of sociology. In our study of the introduction, we covered first we covered the essence of sociology. I said sociology is a scientific study of human social behavior. Sociology is a study of society. We study society with this. Sociology is a systematic study of the following traits in societies of human beings. And these are the following traits: development structures, interaction and collective behavior. Developmental structures, interaction between societies, and collective behavior. The essential definition of sociology is the study of the aspects of human life that results from being members of society. Study of the aspects of human life that results from our being members of society. The study of the agreements people make in society. So this sociology is in fact is a system of agreement between society, between people, and that's what we study. That's what we seek to understand. These are the agreements people make in society. People can agree to be living in a totalitarian state. People can agree to live in a democratic state. People can agree to live in a socialist or communist state. These are the agreements that we see in the world today in sociology. And as Christian sociologists, we seek to understand, we are going to try to unravel and uncover what it means to live and make these agreements in society that we can understand and see. And as a study of the aspects of human life, there are many aspects of human life that we can understand with this course. The results being members. If you are a healthy member of society, that if you are a contributor of society, you are somewhat a member of a social group. And in this social dynamic, there are certain things that we need to understand in order to be that effective member of society. So that is why we study this. And lastly, the essential definition, we believe that the application of scientific method this basically is what we're going to talk about today in this section of the lecture. I mentioned that the sociology that we thought is the queen of sciences, that they believe that sociology was above all scholastic and scientific discipline. They believe that sociology encompassed all philosophy, all science, all religion and faith. This grand system theory, that's what Horton and Hunt proposed. Sociology was an all-encompassing subject in that it encompassed all of the disciplines, sciences, so that when this was proposed as a learning discipline, they believed that it was one of the queen of science, queen of the sciences. And understanding sociology, this term was coined by Auguste Comte of France. He was known as the father of sociology. And there are 7 fathers. I mentioned some of them: Herbert Spencer, Karl Marx, Emile Durkheim, and so and so forth. And there's about 7 of them. I'm going to refer to them as we discuss them in the lecture and how they impacted modern sociology. Sociology is predicated on the strong scientific orientations. That is why we're gonna apply the scientific method, just like Durkheim. And these are the implications. Has so many different kinds of implications in our society, history, law, and political science. It has so much applications in our understanding of sociology. In our introduction of this is what we covered. And as we dig deeper into our methods and research, we come to science and scientific method. Science and scientific method. And I named this and I named this section as research methods. But this, in fact, is a little bit of a misnomer in a way, in that these methods and research, as we go deep, as we dig deeper into them, I'm going to talk about the method of research, foundations of sociology, institutional sociology, and so on and so forth. And as you look at the screen, I just briefly want to go over what we outlined and to see what kind of trajectory we're going on. First, we're going to study the intro and the essence of sociology, the essential definitions. We went over that. Essential definition is a scientific study of social relationships, and we talked about the telos of sociology for a long time last week. Part 2, we talked about the method and research. Sociology as a social science is a relationship of sociology to other social sciences. Other social sciences are anthropology, psychology, economics, these certain things, these things. Social science is also incorporates sociology. So sociology is part of the social science. Human geography, economics, linguistics, political science, anthropology, communication, cultural studies, development studies, law, psychology, right? Here you see like a circle pattern. It encompasses everything. It's an all-encompassing science: economics, psychology, political science, history, anthropology, geology, and so on and so forth. So these are also the branches of social science. And social science as research. This is where we come to the research part. Social science as this research works to answer many of the questions we have about human behavior. So social science, in a way, it seeks to understand hows and the whys. There's always the how. How do we do this as social members? And also the social sciences research, it seeks to understand why we do this. Why do people do certain things in society? Why do certain people behave this way? Why do people resort to these certain things? So social psychology is one of the big areas of sociology and its study of society, social psychology, social economy. These are very interesting and basically very interesting and very attractive areas of sociology that we can look at. Hows and the whys. It asks these two questions. And we believe that scientific method of experimentation, empirical research is very readily applicable to social research. Scientific method, the first scientific method, first step, and we're going to get into this method, is asking a question. First step of scientific method is asking a question. Why does this behavior continue to happen in our society? Why do certain behaviors increase? And why do certain societal patterns occur over here? Why? And how does this perpetuate in our society? How does this kind of controlled experiment apply to our social behavior, our social thinking? So asking this kind of question and seeking that answer, right, is part of this first step of scientific method. And the second step of the scientific method is forming a hypothesis. as you all learned in high school or junior high science classes, forming a hypothesis is the first step of one of the first steps of the scientific method. We form a hypothesis, and with that hypothesis, we want to prove it or disprove it, or we want to see how the data that we collect shows us about this hypothesis. Hypothesis can be a variety of different things, but we're going to come back to that. And then the experiment. We in social science and sociology, we perform a controlled experiment, and we're gonna uncover some of the experiments that occurred, famous experiments that occurred, and we will see how that how the data and the results from that experiment has to do with sociology. And the step 4 of scientific method is observe and record. So we observe the findings of the scientific method, we get the data, we observe it, record it. Step 5 is we draw conclusions from those data. We collect the data, observe it, record it, and we draw our conclusions from these experiments. Scientific method, just an overview, it systemically gives you a step-by-step procedure to seek the facts and the theories in order to prove the hypothesis, or in order to disprove it. We continue to proceed by collecting data and giving step-by-step procedure to seek facts or theories. Scientific method is strong in that it relies on evidence. Just as we need facts and data in order to have this kind of research, scientific method totally relies on evidence. So social behavior or society or sociology is fundamentally rooted when the scientific method is applied. Is firmly rooted on evidence. Only this evidence can be something that proves or disproves the hypothesis or theory. So that's very important. It also uses different kind of concepts. Uses concepts of social theory. It uses variety of different kinds of ideas. Also, scientific method keeps objectivity. It's not biased in other way. Also, scientific method highlights itself by following ethical neutrality. By principle, it should be neutral ethically. It shouldn't bias the method, and this method should be ethically neutral. And yet we're going to find out in our studies examples that I'm going to share, famous social experiments that happen. We're going to find out that this ethical neutrality, this area of ethics is not as black and white as we think, and some of the experiments went over had ethical problems, had ethical questions and issues. And scientific method also formulates generalization, ensures verifiability, and uses logical reasoning to proceed. So these are the strengths. There are definitely different methods of collection of data, and there are different ways of getting these data and the facts. And data and facts are other materials for analysis, and making this hypothesis provable and this testing of the hypothesis possible. In order to make this possible, we need to have these variety of different methods of collecting different data. one of the data observation can be just gathering data by viewing it, observing it, understanding by seeing it. So you observe it and you gather. Just very simple observation. Second way of gathering data, method of gathering data is interviewing. You go to a person, you go to an institution, you go to a social group or area, and you interview them, interview specific different individuals, and you gather information and collection. You collect data in that way. Interviewing usually involves face-to-face communication, one-on-one, so you get the direct primary source of data, information and data. Also, there's another way of collecting data is mailing a survey. You have a different kind of questions, control questions, and what you do is basically give them a set of questions to answer, and with this survey and this questionnaire, from the results from these questions, you get to make your point of collecting this data. Also, there's another way of gathering data is experimentations, and this is where you have different kinds of variables, control variables. You control them in a way that you want to test your hypothesis. Other ways of getting data is sociometry, simulation, and those are less popular ways of getting it. Social science research, it deals with people. It uses methods and transition of social science. We can know that people are less predictable than non-human phenomena. Social world is constantly changing. People can be where research being conducted on them. So these are some of the challenges of gathering these social data from research. And we can make certain conclusions from the data. This inquiry method of social science research. So social science research looks for patterns in human behavior as well as connections among those behavior. So the fundamental basis of social science research, it looks for patterns in human behavior and connects them among those behaviors and makes a conclusion. So again, here we go. The two questions that we ask, why and the what happens, how and the why. These are the frequently asked questions that we must first ask. And then we make a hypothesis, and we make a certain way of proving the hypothesis, understanding the hypothesis. We will basically, when we go through the scientific method in social science, we will learn the answers to these questions using the methods of social scientists. Social scientists have used these methods in the past in order to receive these answers to these questions. So we are going to apply that directly in our research, in our understanding, in our thought process. The most frequently asked questions, these basically start as we have one question we want to ask about this social theory, about this social science, about this social phenomena, and this basically experiment starts from there. So when we understand social science research method, we'll be able to read, analyze the results done by others. So when we know the pattern, when we know how this works, we can understand different areas of this social phenomenon. Again, I mentioned before, there's branches of different social scientists. Anthropology, study of man. History, study of time and what happened in the past. Archaeology, human geography, economics, law. These are social sciences that have connections with sociology. Economics, law, development studies, education, criminology, political science, very important. translation studies, media studies, business management, philosophy, health, international relations, linguistics, cultural studies, and psychology. These are all branches of the social sciences. And we come to today about our some of our famous social experiments. I won't be able to cover them all today, so we'll continue them in our next lecture section. Some of these famous social experiments, and I had put the picture up there, keep calm, it's only a social experiment. Sometimes the understanding of, okay, the social experiments are starting, is beginning, oh my gosh, I'm in a social experiment, then the social experiment, it defeats the purpose of experiment. Sometimes experiments have to be real, and they need to believe that they're not being experimented on in order to have legitimate results and data. So researchers and modern sociologists have gone the lengths, have gone the distance, and somewhat crossed ethical boundaries in order to receive and get the results and data that they wanted, the phenomena and the attention that they wanted. Even if they receive data and results, some of these experiments, if it wasn't that scandalous, if it wasn't that shocking, if it didn't have that shock factor, it wouldn't have had nationwide attention, national media coverage, and so on and so forth. So some of the experiments that I'm about to share today may be somewhat graphic, maybe somewhat shocking, because, and some of them have even found ourselves in our cultural arena and made itself into a movie or a TV show. And you may have heard of some of these social experiments. And these famous social experiments ultimately follow the pattern of the scientific method. So it is logical. It does have a logical train of thought, logical process in order to understand different human social behavior. And yet, every time I mention a social experiment, I want to mention the fact that not all our behavior is just empirically categorized. So not all our behavior can be explained by science. That's what I want to make that point. Some of our motives, and in the Bible, God tells us only He knows the deepest motives of our heart. So we want to make this case of Christian sociology, Christian understanding of society and behavior. We want to have that lens before we go into modern ideas and famous social experiments. So having that is very important. But I'm going to make that case throughout this course toward the middle of our lecture series. And some of these famous social experiments include the following. The first experiment I want to share and talk about is the bystander effect. Bystander apathy, or this is called bystander apathy effect or experiment. So in 1964, there was an incident where there was a bartender named Kitty Genovese. She was a 28-year-old bartender, and what happened was a murder case, and she was murdered, not in broad daylight, it was at night. She was stabbed to death in Queens, New York. So this became a huge shock, and became a textbook case and study of sociology. So when you have a textbook on sociology, this will be one of the favorites, one of the first chapters of sociology and social theory. This bystander apathy or bystander effect happened, this theory, basically, the basic premise understanding of this theory, or conclusion, I'm going to make a conclusion, claim was that this bystander effect, it states from this case in 1964, it states that individuals, just random, you and me, anyone, these random individuals are less likely to offer help to a victim when there are other people present. So when there's other people, not just one witness, you're not the only one, right? There's other people, bystanders. If there are more than one people, if the more people are present watching this crime happen before your eyes, they are less likely to offer help to a victim when there are other people, many other bystanders present. This murder happened in Queens, New York, as I mentioned. There are various factors. There are numbers of bystanders, ambiguity, group cohesiveness, diffusion of responsibility that reinforces denial. So what happened was this New York Times basically published this article claiming that there were 38 witnesses and bystanders that saw and heard the attack on Kitty. Her name was Kitty. And this incident prompted this effect called the bystander effect, or Genovese syndrome. And New York Times published in a way that was very sensational and inflammatory, very inciting that not one of the bystanders, the 38 bystanders who saw that, none of them called the police. So they basically fueled the fire in the story. And this murder victim was basically, she died, and another perpetrator who stabbed Kitty Genovese to death was named Winston Mosley. He was a 29-year-old Manhattan native who confessed to the killing of Kitty and a couple of other individuals. These attacks, what happened was she was coming home late after work, and when she noticed that someone was following her with a, I think, hunting knife, these attacks basically happened over an extended time period. So when the crime happened, it didn't happen in an instant. It was an extended period of time. And there are accounts where how this Winston, the murderer, he actually stabbed her a couple of times, fled the scene, and about 15-20 minutes later, he came back onto this crime scene again to finish his crime, because she was still alive. And all her, she was yelling, help, this person's trying to kill me, stab me to death. And yet no one really did anything. It was dark. And what happened that complicated this situation more was that this was before 1964, this was before New York City implemented 911 emergency calls. So they would have to call the police. Attacks spanned approximately half an hour, police report said. There were witnesses before, but this was before the 911 system, emergency call system was implemented. So the police and local authorities came too late. And ultimately, Kitty Genovese died on the way to the hospital. So the headline, sensational inflammatory journalism, all this headline was, okay, 38, who did it, who saw the murder and did nothing. The 38 bystander effect, you see, the screen. Bystander effect. My gosh, these 38 people, about 40 people did nothing. They saw. And if you see the picture on the left on the screen, all the people in the apartment, kind of this New York style apartment, shows shows the villain, the knife. This woman is being stabbed and saying, please help, please someone do something. And all the hashtags that you see are like, okay, stand with her, hashtag unite for her, do something, hashtag doing something, hashtag do something, hashtag ban knives. They're all saying all of these things and yet doing nothing because there are so many bystanders. This is the bystander effect. And New York Times continued publishing this article saying that they interviewed some of the witnesses, and they claimed that one of the witnesses said, I don't want to get involved. And these fueled national outrage, saying that what were these witnesses thinking and doing? So Genevieve's case and her murder, Kitty Genevieve's murder, became emblematic. It became a symbol of the callousness and the apathy of life in big cities, especially like New York. So this is why it's called bystander apathy, because it highlighted the apathy of individuals living in a big crowded city like New York. So the more bystander there are, the more people doing nothing, it's likely that people won't, follow. They'll just follow and do nothing as well. This was the theory. This was the social theory that this experiment or this case basically proved. Later on, after the New York Times article, because it became so public, so nationwide, nationally shocking, a police report revealed later that there were actually not just 38 witnesses, but there were 49 witnesses, almost 50. And there were inaccuracies that were revealed with this case. The more accurate study revealed none saw the attack in its entirety. It was late at night, it was dark in the streets. None of the witnesses actually saw what happened, the attack in its entire form. Only a few of the witnesses actually glimpsed parts of it, parts of the attack, and recognized cries for help. Only a few of the witnesses heard, like, help me, he's stabbing me. Many of the witnesses, after the police report was released, many of the witnesses thought actually they heard like a lover's quarrel. They thought it was like a fight between a boyfriend and girlfriend. And they didn't recognize the cry for help. It was very difficult to hear. Or some of the witnesses thought they were just drunks fighting with each other. And the police reports revealed that 2 people actually called the police. So the fact that New York Times article said that none of them called the police, none of them actually said anything to the police, reported anything, that was something like very inaccurate. That was inaccurate. Actually, people did call, and people tried to help. Some of them yelled to the murderer, and they stopped doing that. What happened in the actual murder was that Winston, the murderer, actually stabbed Kitty twice, and then left the scene. And Kitty basically, if you see the street, if you're in the middle of the street, if you're getting stabbed, you can basically be seen. But what Kitty tried to do was go into like apartment, but she as she crawled there, the doors of the apartment were locked and she couldn't get in. And basically what happened was the murderer came back, stabbed her, and police report shows that she was raped, and then finally, when the police report showed that she had stab marks in her hand, which means she tried to stop, resist as much as possible. And also, what happened was, after this case, or after she was murdered, or after she was being stabbed and the murderer left the scene, there was another witness who was with her and called the police, who was with her until until 911 and paramedics and the authorities came. So she was not alone when she passed away. And on the way to the hospital, she actually succumbed to her wounds and then died, passed away with that incident. So there are some inaccurate reportings of this case, and yet this case still remains one of the most shocking, one of the most famous, one of the most infamous social effects. So in the scientific, if we apply the scientific, as emotional as it is, when we apply the scientific method to this case, it's interesting to know that because this is not, it wasn't an experiment, so to say, didn't happen in a study, didn't happen in a lab, this bystander effect was something that many did not really think it was going to happen, but it did happen. That's why it startled so many people. That's why it was very shocking to the American public. A second experiment, very famous, was Asch conformity experiment. This experimental procedure Asch used in a lab. This lab experiments to study conformity, where 50 male students of Swarthmore College in the US participated in vision tests. I don't know if you've seen this before. You see, like, on Instagram feeds, there are different lines, or even usually it's kind of like that one picture on Instagram. Is this blue or gold? This color experiment, it's kind of related to that. A lot of people would say blue, like say with gold. Kind of like that, this vision test, using a line to judgment task. Basically, the experimenter put a naive participant in a room with 7 people. They agreed in advance what their responses would be presented with the line test. Participant did not know, he was naive. He was led to believe that other 7 were all real participants. So each person in the room had to state aloud which comparison, like line A, B, or C, was most like the target line. The answer was always obvious. The real participant sat at the end of the row, gave his or her answer to the last. There were 18 trials in total, and basically all these 7 people who were there, they gave the wrong answer every time. In these 12 critical trials, they all answered wrong. So what Asch was interested to see was if the real participant would conform to the majority view. All these majority would continue to give wrong answers, and each of the people who came in and was supposed to answer correctly, Asch was interested to see if this person would conform, or have his or her own opinion. So Asch's experiment also had a control condition where there were no the 7 people who always answered wrong, but there was actually only a real participant. Some of the findings from this basically resulted in that Asch measured the number of times each participant conformed, to the majority view. And on average, about 1/3 of the participants who were placed in this situation went along and confirmed. So about 32%, 1/3 of the participants who were placed in this situation, they went along and conformed. They gave the wrong answer, with the clearly incorrect majority of the critical trials. So over 12 of the critical trials, about 75 of the participants conformed at least once. 25 of the participants never conformed. So only 25 never conformed. In the control group, with no pressure to conform to these 7 misleading people, less than 1% gave the wrong answer. So the conclusion from this experiment, this conformity experiment, was that why did the participants conform so readily? Why did they conform so readily? When they were interviewed after the experiment, they conducted an interview. Most of them said that they did not really believe they were conforming to the answers. Interesting, huh? But they went along with the group for the fear of being ridiculed. So they thought they were giving the wrong answer. They didn't really think that. They thought that they would be ridiculed for not conforming. But they went along with the group for the fear of being ridiculed or thought peculiar. There was a fear in these participants, innate fear, that if they did not conform and go along, that they would be ridiculed for being odd, for being the person who did not conform. Few of them also said in their interview that they did really believe the group answers were correct. They actually believed that the people who gave the wrong answer, they were correct. Apparently, people conform for 2 main reasons. This experiment concluded that they want to fit in with the group. There is an innate need to fit in, conform, because they want to belong. This is the normative influence, and because also they believe that the group is better informed than they are. This is called informational influence. Again, to say that again, people conform for 2 reasons. They conform because they wanted to belong. There's a human need, sociological need to belong to a community. And also because that they believe that the group knows better than the individual. So these were the conclusions of Ash's conformity experiments. So the first experiment concluded that if there are bystanders present, they're less likely to act like they're more readily conforming to the group. Similar to this one conformity experiment, they want to belong. People want to belong to a group, and people think that the group is more well informed. This is going to another experiment. I'm sure you've heard of this experiment, the Bobo-Dahl experiment. In this experiment, this involved exposing children to different adult models. So this experiment was conducted so that we have a better understanding of children and their development and in violence. In this Bobo-Dahl experiment, it was conducted by these people who wanted to see these children, if they were revealed, if they're exposed to certain violent influences. These 2 different adult models. One was non-aggressive, one was aggressive. So they went and they made a room, and in one corner the male adult was present, and the children would enter. And another corner, another experiment, another room, another male was present, and the children would enter. And in these 2 rooms, one room, the person, the adult model will be violent, will show violent traits to a doll, like with a hammer. It will hit the doll continuously, aggressive model. And also, this experiment showed a non-aggressive model. Adults showed non-aggressive behavior. And the experiment wanted to show, after witnessing and seeing the adult's behavior, with these children, what would they do if they're placed in a room without the model, and they were observed to see what these intimate behaviors they witnessed would resurface, if they would replicate this behavior. Would they continue this violence on the doll that they saw? Would they continue that? Would they see that? Would they show that in their behavior? So the predictions for this experiment, Bandura made several key predictions about what would occur during this Bobo doll experiment. There were some predictions. The researcher or the experimenter believed that the male children would behave more aggressively than female children, girls. So children who observed, secondly, they thought the children who observed the adult acting aggressively would be likely to act aggressively even when the adult model was not present. So this means basically that male children were more likely, and they predicted that they were more likely to mirror and show aggression based on what they saw, even when the model adult was not present. Thirdly, they predicted that children would be more likely to imitate models of the same gender than the models of the opposite gender. So male children will mimic and model male adults, and female children will mimic more of the female adults. That was one of the predictions and premises. Fourthly, they predicted that the children who observed non-aggressive adult model will be less aggressive than the children who observed the aggressive model. So non-aggressive exposure group would be also less aggressive than the control group. The participants of the experiment with 36 boys and 36 girls enrolled at Stanford University Nursery School. The children ranged in age between 3 and almost 6, and the average participant was 4 years, 4 months. So there were a total of 8 experimental groups. Out of these participants, 24 were assigned to a group that would not be exposed to adult models, 24 of them. The rest of the children were divided into 2 groups of 24 participants each. One of the experimental groups would be exposed to aggressive models, with the other 24 would be non-aggressive models. And another 24 were not exposed. These groups were divided again into groups of boys and girls. Each of these subgroups then were divided so that half the participants will be exposed to the same sex adult model. The other half will be exposed to opposite gender model. Before conducting this experiment, the Bobo doll experiment, Bandura also assessed the children's existing levels of aggression, so that they would understand that these children were not aggressive before. Then these groups were matched equally so that they had average levels of aggression. So they were all somehow starting at the same point. The procedure of this experiment was conducted in this way. Each child tested individually to ensure that the behavior would not be influenced by other children. So they were individually placed. The child first brought into the playroom where there were a number of different activities to explore. They're not just the doll, being violent to the doll. The experimenter then invited an adult model into the playroom, encouraged the model to sit at the table across the room, and from the child who had similar activities. So over this 10-minute period, the adult model began to play with the children or tinker with toys in a non-aggressive condition. In this non-aggressive, the adult would just play. And the adult model simply played and ignored the Bobo doll for the entire period. But in the aggressive condition, the adult model would be brought in over this 10-minute playing time. The aggressive model, the adult, would really aggressively attack, violently attack the Bobo doll. The children would observe that. This model laid the Bobo doll on its side and sat on it, punched it repeatedly in the nose. The model then raised the Bobo doll, picked up the mallet like a hammer, and struck the doll in the head. This following the mallet aggression, the model tossed the doll up. Adult tossed the doll up aggressively and kicked it about in the room. The sequence of physically aggressive act was repeated 3 times. It was interspersed with verbally aggressive responses. In addition to him, as these phrases that aggressive paired with the physical aggression was kick him, and like pow, and these noises were matched with aggressive actions. The models also added non-aggressive phrases. He sure is a tough one. He keeps coming back for more. And the 10 minutes exposure to the adult model, and the child was taken to another room after these 10-minute aggressive exposure. The child was taken to another room that contained a number of appealing toys, including doll set, fire engine, toy airplane. The children were permitted to play for a brief 2 minutes. They told they were no longer allowed to play with any of these tempting toys. The purpose of this was to build up frustration levels among the young children. This room contained a number of aggressive toys using mallet, tether ball with a face on it, dart guns, and of course the Bobo doll. The room also includes several non-aggressive toys, including crayons, paper dolls, plastic animals, and trucks. Each child was then allowed to play in this room for a period of 20 minutes. During this time, the raters observed the child's behavior from behind a one-way mirror, judged the child's level of aggression. And the results were shockingly staggering. The results of the experiment supported 3 of these 4 original predictions. Bandura and his colleagues predicted that children non-aggressive group would behave less aggressively. The results indicated that while children of both genders in the non-aggressive group did tend to exhibit less aggression than the control group, boys who had observed the opposite sex models behave non-aggressively were more likely than those of the control group to engage in violence. So children exposed to the violent models tended to imitate its exact behavior. So people who observed violence, they tended to show the exact same aggression, same violence. Researchers were correct in their prediction. If the adult model was no longer present, the child showed exactly the same aggression behavior. Researchers were correct again in their prediction that boys would behave more aggressively than girls. Boys engaged more than twice as many acts of physical aggression than the girls. Boys showed twice as more aggression than the girls. There were more important gender differences when it came to whether the same gender, opposite gender model was observed. Boys who observed the adult males behaving violently were more influenced. So this experiment concluded that if a male child saw a male model adult show aggression, that they were more likely to mimic that than the opposite. If they were shown to if a boy saw a female model show that aggression. So same gender basically heightened the result, heightened the aggression. Interestingly, the experiments found in the same gender groups, boys were more likely to imitate physical acts of violence, while the girls were more likely to imitate verbal aggression. See that boys showed more physical aggression, and the girls showed more verbal aggression. So these gender differences actually happen. The results of these experiments supported under a social learning theory. This Bobo experiment, Bandura and his colleagues believe that the experiment demonstrates how specific behaviors can be learned through observation and imitation. So certain social behaviors can be just observed by seeing and imitating. The author suggested that social imitation may hasten or shortcut the acquisition of new behaviors without the necessity of reinforcing successive approximations. According to Bandura, the violent behavior of the adult models toward adults led children to believe such actions were acceptable social behavior. He also suggested that as a result, children may be more inclined to respond to frustration with aggression in the future. In a follow-up study conducted in 1965, Bandura found that while children were more likely to imitate aggressive behavior if the adult model was rewarded for his or her actions. If the adult model received rewards for being violent or being aggressive, then the children were more likely to do that. If they showed aggression and the adults were rewarded, the model was rewarded, children did exactly the same thing. They're more likely to act that way. And they were far less likely to imitate these actions if the adult was being punished or reprimanded for hostile behavior. So when the child saw that these aggressive hostile behavior were punished, were reprimanded, were rebuked, then the child was less likely to do that, less likely to show hostile behavior. Very interesting, very shocking. This impacts, Bobo experiment impact was significant. Not only in the idea, and there are some pictures of disturbing pictures of these experiments online, and if you can just search Bobo experiment, there were 1961 experiments, 1963 experiments, and 1965 experiment was experiment with reinforced punishment and rewards. So these studies have practical implications as well. So because Bandura's social learning theory showed that by observing violence, children showed violence. So basically all these violent games that they would see and violent movies that they saw, this was actually, and if this movie, if these adult models that they saw, let's say they saw like a movie, very violent movie, like a thug basically being violent, and they would get rewarded. And at the end of the movie, they won't get any punishment, they would be rewarded. Like a bank robber robs a bank, threatens and you know and he is violent to other people, and then they get rewarded with the money from the bank, and they don't get any consequence. The child who sees that violent act, basically how these children being influenced, they could be influenced in that way by watching these violent media, watching aggression, watching aggressive action shown on media. And this reinforcement of punishment and reward, the social learning theory proposes that people learn largely through observation, imitation, and modeling. So it demonstrated that people learn not only by being rewarded or punished, but they can also learn from watching someone else being rewarded or punished. See that? Not only do they learn by personal, okay, if I do this, I'll be rewarded. If I do this, I'll be punished. They don't just learn by that. They also learn from watching someone else being rewarded or punished. Oh, that behavior is rewarded? Okay, I will act in this way. Or that behavior is punished by this person? Oh, I will act in another way. So these children were influenced in this way. Two major theories that added to this ongoing study and effect was basically the media influences were general aggression model and the cultivation theory. General aggression model, as known as GAM, it emphasizes how children and us, we develop aggressive attitudes from exposure to violent media depiction and how it relates to aggressive behavior. Violent video games, as I mentioned, it became a widespread phenomenon in society. And also violent video games, violent videos, violent shows, violent movies. Basically, kids and children, and also us, once we gain this knowledge, once we gain the understanding, when we're exposed to these realistic violent media, game, we also behave more aggressively through actions and through words. Also, this cultivation theory, this argues that more a child engages in media, the more they will be affected by the media. So the more time the child spends engaged in this media, the more people will be affected, the more this child will be affected by the media. So in the same way, if the child is consuming the more violent content that the child consumes, the larger effect that this content will have on the child. So this Bobodal experiment is supported by GAM, also cultivation theory, and not only the social learning theory. So this conclusion of this experiment supports the social learning theory, and when we observe one another's actions, the aggression model and the less aggressive model, they tend to behave in a similar or same aggressive manner. So in modern society, not in 1965, 1967, kids just observe and consume the violent media, and they just act in that way, even if that violence is fictional, it's fantasy. So this Bobodal experiment has huge implications. Crazy thing is that violence in movies, not just media, also violence in pornography. These media this exposure to these kind of violent mediums, this has profound implications, impacts on a child's brain, the child's development. Some of these criticisms included reliability, motivation, and some of these ethical claims have been addressed. In this university level, it basically summarized that the subjects were manipulated in responding in an aggressive manner. They were also conducted with children and toys. So these long-term implications, that the subjects were taunted, subjects were not allowed to play and incited agitation, and basically they had ethical claims by saying these children were incited, these children were egged on to show aggression, to be aggressive. And some of the other claims of criticism were that as studies went on in the early 2000s, they described the frontal lobe of the children younger than 8 was underdeveloped, and they weren't able to separate reality to fantasy. So children under the age of 8, because their frontal lobe of the brain is underdeveloped, they cannot separate from reality to fantasy. For instance, children up to the age of 12 may believe that monsters in their closets or under their beds, because sometimes they are unable to distinguish dreams from reality. So analysis of the 1961 study made note of the fact children's imitations of aggressive behavior occur almost immediately after observing the model. So due to the such short time interval between the observations and the imitation, the conclusions cannot be made by this just act. It can just be just copying what they saw. So they cannot make these criticism basically asserted that they cannot make a long-term effect. They cannot make a resultant claim based on these long-term effects on exposure to violence. Many biological theorists and other scientists also ignored and did not support and argued against social learning theory regarding these brain developments and certain things like that. So this experiment conducted by Albert Bandura, Canadian-American psychologist and sociologist, including social learning theory. Yeah, this was a shocking experiment that occurred, that had a lot of criticism, that had a lot of theories and things like that. Yes, and these follow-up experiments also showed this Bobo-Dahl experiment showed also that not only these violent media and video games exposure led to the same kind of violence, but these long-term impacts of these violent exposure was in question. The next experiment that we are going to see is the Stanford prison experiment. And this was an experiment that was also very shocking. Stanford prison experiment. This occurred this was conducted by Zimbardo. This experiment was very famous that it was made into a movie. And this experiment was very interesting in that, excuse me, this Zimbardo, this procedure started by study the roles people play in situations, in prisons kind of situation. Zimbardo basically converted a basement. It's called the Stanford Prison Experiment. So they converted a basement into a mock prison. And he basically he sent an advertisement saying that he advertised saying, hey, I'm asking volunteers to participate in a study of psychological effects of prison life. The 75 applicants who answered in the ad, they were given diagnostic interviews, personality tests to eliminate candidates with psychological problems. So if a candidate had a psychological problem, he immediately disqualified them, or medical disability, or history of crime and drug abuse. Out of the 75 who applied, Zimbardo selected 24 men, judged to be the most physical and mentally stable, the most mature, and the least involved in antisocial behaviors were chosen to participate. These participants did not know each other prior to the study. They were paid $15 a day to take part in the experiment. The participants were randomly assigned to enter the role of prisoner or guard in a stimulated prison environment in the Stanford University basement. There were 2 reserves and 1 dropped out, finally leaving 10 prisoners and 11 guards. 10 prisoners and 11 guards. Prisoners were treated like every other criminal, being arrested in their own homes without warning and taken to the local police station. They were fingerprinted, photographed, and booked. They were blindfolded and driven to the psychology department of Stanford University, whereas Zimbardo had the basement set up as a prison with barred doors and windows, bare walls, and small cells. Here, the de-individualization process began. When the prisoners arrived at the prison, they were stripped naked and had all their personal possessions removed and locked away, and were given prison clothes and their bedding. And they were issued a uniform and referred to their number only, not their name. This use of ID numbers was to make prisoners feel anonymous. Each prisoner had to be called by only his ID number, and could only refer to himself and the other prisoners by number. Their clothes were comprised of a smock with a number written on it, but no underclothes. They also had tight nylon cap to cover their hair and a lock chain around one ankle. The guards were dressed in identical uniform with khaki, and they carried a whistle around their neck and a billy club borrowed from the police. Guards also wore special sunglasses to make eye contact with the prisoners impossible. So 3 guards worked shifts of 8 hours each day. The other guys remained on call. The guards were instructed to do whatever they thought was necessary to maintain order, to maintain law and order in the prison, and they commanded to command respect from the prisoners. No physical violence were permitted. It was not permitted. Zimbardo observed the behavior of the prisoners and guards as a researcher, and also he acted as a prison warden. The findings from this experiment was incredible. Within a very short time, both guards and prisoners were settling into their new roles, with the guards adopting theirs quickly and easily. This asserting authority. Within the hours of beginning the experimentation, some guards began to harass the prisoners At 2:30 a.m., prisoners were awakened from sleep by blasting whistles on the first day, first of many counts. The counts served as a way of familiarizing the prisoners to the numbers. More importantly, they provided a regular occasion for the guards to exercise control over the prisoners. The prisoners soon adopted their prison-like behavior as well. They talked about prison issues a great deal of the time. They told tales to each other, to the guards. They told tales on each other to the guards. And they started making prison rules. They started taking prison rules very seriously, as though they were there for the prisoners' benefit, and infringement would spell disaster on all of them. Now, some of them began siding with the guards against prisoners who did not obey the rules. Physical punishment. And there were no physical violence, but physical punishment occurred. The prisoners were taunted with insults and petty orders. They were given pointless and boring tasks to accomplish. They were generally dehumanized. Push-ups were a common form of physical punishment imposed by the guards. One of the guards stepped on the prisoners' backs while they did push-ups, or made other prisoners sit on the backs of fellow prisoners doing their push-ups. Asserting independence. Because the first day passed without incident, the guards were surprised and totally unprepared for the rebellion which broke out in the morning of the second day. During the second day experiment, the prisoners removed their stocking caps, ripped off their numbers, and barricaded themselves inside their cells by putting their beds against the door. The guards called in reinforcements. The 3 guards who were waiting on standby duty on call came the night shift, and the night shift guards voluntarily remained on duty, so 6 guards. The guards retaliated by a fire extinguisher. They shot a stream of skin-chilling carbon dioxide. They forced the prisoners away from the doors. Next, the guards broke into each cell, stripped the prisoners naked, took the beds out. The ringleaders of the prisoner rebellion were placed in solitary confinement. After this, the guards generally began to harass and intimidate the prisoners. Special privileges of the one of 3 cells were designated a privileged cell. The 3 prisoners least involved in the rebellion were given special privileges. The guards gave them back their uniforms, beds, and allowed them to wash their hair, brush their teeth. Privileged prisoners also got to eat special food at the presence of other prisoners who had temporarily lost privileges of eating. The effect was break the solidarity among the prisoners. These are the consequences of the rebellion. Over the next few days, the relation between the guards and prisoners changed. A change in one leading to a change in the other. Remember that the guards were firmly in control of the prisoners, were totally dependent on them. The prisoners became more dependent. The guards became more derisive towards them. They held the prisoners in contempt, let the prisoners know that they held them in contempt. And the guards' contempt for them grew. The prisoners became more submissive. The prisoners became even more submissive. And the guards became more aggressive. They demanded greater obedience. The prisoners depended on the guards for everything, so they tried to find a way to please the guards, such as telling tales on fellow prisoners. Prisoner A612, interesting prisoner. Less than 36 hours into the experiment, prisoner A612 began suffering from acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying, and rage. After meeting with the guards, they told him he was weak, but offered an informant status. So A612 returned to other prisoners and said, "You can't leave, you can't quit." Soon, A612 began to act crazy, scream, curse, go into rage that seemed out of control. It was until this point that the psychologists realized that they had to let him out. The next day, the guards held a visiting hour for parents and friends. They were worried that the parents saw the state of the jail. They might insist on taking sons home. Guards washed their prisoners, had them clean and polish their cells, fed them big dinner, played music on the intercom. After the visit, rumors spread on a mass escape plan. Afraid that they would lose the prisoners, the guards experimenters tried to enlist the help of facilities of the Palo Alto Police Department. The guards again escalated the levels of harassment, forcing them to do menial, repetitive work, such as cleaning the toilets with their bare hands. Zimbardo invited a Catholic priest who had been a prisoner chaplain to evaluate how realistic this prison situation was. Half of the prisoners introduced themselves by number rather than name. The chaplain interviewed each prisoner individually. The priest told them the only way to get out was the help of a lawyer. Prisoner 819, eventually while talking to the priest, 819 broke down and began to cry hysterically. Just two previously released prisoners, just as the two previously released prisoners had. The psychologist removed the chain from his foot, cap over his head, and told him to go and rest in a room that was adjacent to the prison yard. They told him that they would get him some food and they'd take him to see a doctor. While this was going on, one of the guards lined up the other prisoners and had them chant aloud. Prisoner 819 was a bad prisoner because of what prisoner 819 did. My cell is a mess, Mr. Correctional Officer. The psychologist realized that 819 could hear the chanting and went back into the room where they found him sobbing uncontrollably. The psychologist tried to get him to agree to leave the experiment, but he said he could not leave because others had labeled him a bad prisoner. Back to reality. At that point, Zimbardo said, "Listen, you are not 819, you are his name. And my name is Dr. Zimbardo. I'm a psychologist, not a prison superintendent. This is not a real prison. This is just an experiment. And those are students, not prisoners, just like you. Let's go." He stopped crying suddenly, looked up and said, "Okay, let's go," as if nothing had been wrong. An end to the experiment. Zimbardo 1973 had intended the experiment should be run for 2 weeks. But on the 6th day, it was terminated due to the emotional breakdowns of the prisoners and excessive aggression of the guards. Christina Masalak, the recent Stanford PhD, brought in to conduct interviews with each of the guards and prisoners. Strongly objected when she saw the prisoners being abused by the guards. Filled with outrage, she said, "It's terrible what you are doing to these boys." Out of 50 or more outsiders who had seen our prison, she was the only one who ever questioned its morality. Zimbardo 2008 later noted, "It wasn't until much later that I realized how far into my prison role I was at that point. At that I was thinking like a prison superintendent rather than a research psychologist." So the conclusion of this experiment was this. According to Zimbardo and his colleagues, the Stanford prison experiment revealed how people will readily conform to the social roles that are expected to play. Especially, even himself, he said, "I began thinking like a prison warden rather than a psychologist." This Stanford prison experiment revealed how people readily conform to the social roles they are expected to play, especially if the roles are as strongly stereotyped as those of the prison guard. So the more stereotyped this role is, social role is, the more likely would people readily conform to this idea, to this social role. Because the guards in this prison experiment were placed in positions of authority, they began to act in ways they would not usually behave in their normal lives. This power corrupted their actions. The prison environment was an important factor in creating the guards' brutal behavior. None of the participants who acted as guards showed sadistic tendencies before the study. Therefore, the findings to support the situational explanation of behavior rather than the dispositional one, Zimbardo proposed that two processes can explain the prisoner's spinal submission. de-individualization may explain the behavior of the participants, especially the guards. This is a state when you become so immersed in the norms of the group that you lose sense of your identity and personal responsibility. The guards may have been so sadistic because they did not feel what happened was down to them personally. It was a group normal. We all did this. Similar to bystander effect, similar to these things. They also may have lost their sense of personal identity because of the uniform that they wore. It's a uniform. Also learn helplessness could explain prisoners' submission to the guards. The prisoners learned whatever they did had little effect on what happened to them. So they lost all hope. In the mock prison experiment, the unpredictable decisions of the guards led the prisoners to give up responding. After the prison experiment was terminated, Zimbardo interviewed the participants. Most of the participants said that they felt involved and committed. The research had felt real to them. One of the guards said, "I was surprised at myself. I made them call each other by name and clean the toilets out with their bare hands. I practically considered the prisoners cattle, and I kept thinking I had to watch out for them in case they tried something." Another guard said, "Acting authoritatively can be fun. Power can be great pleasure." And another, "During inspection, I went to call to I went to cell 2 to mess up a bed which a prisoner had just made. He grabbed me, screaming that I had just made it and he was not going to let me mess it up. He grabbed me by the throat and thought he was laughing. I was pretty scared. I lashed out with my stick and hit him on the chin, though not very hard. And when I freed myself, I became angry." Most of the guards found it difficult to believe that they had behaved in the brutalizing ways that they had. Many said they hadn't known this side of them existed, or that they were able or capable of such things. The prisoners too could not believe that they had responded in the submissive, cowering, dependent way that they had. Several claimed to be assertive types of normality. Several claimed to be assertive types normally. When they asked about the guards, they described the usual 3 stereotypes that can be found in any prison. Some guards were good, some guards were fair, but some were cruel. This critical evaluation of this study, demand characteristics, could explain the findings of this study. Most of the guards later claimed that they were simply acting. Because of the guards in prisons were playing a role, their behavior may not be influenced by the same factors which affect their behavior in real life. So this means that the study's findings cannot be reasonably generalized to real life, such as prison settings. The study had low ecological validity. However, there is considerable evidence that these participants did react to the situation as though it was real. For example, 90% of the private conversation, which were monitored by researchers, were on the prison condition, and only 10% of them were conversation outside of their prison life. And these are some ethical issues that we're going to cover. These ethical issues, the study has been received by with many ethical criticisms, including lack of fully informed consent by the participants. The prison studies experiments, they did not know what they were signing into. They weren't given proper guidance, proper consent form that prepared them for this kind of experiment. So the experiment Zimbardo conducted was somewhat unpredictable. So even the critics who accused Zimbardo of ethical issues, they criticized Zimbardo by saying even Zimbardo himself did not know what would happen in the experiment if it was predictable. Also, the prisoners did not consent to being arrested at home. So this house arrest arresting the prisoners from their homes was something that was not agreed upon. So ethically, that was wrong. They should have consented to this before they were ultimately. I think this is because they were arrested at home, taken to the police station, fingerprint. All these made the situation more real. The prisoners were not told, partly because the final approval from the police wasn't given until minutes before the participants decided to participate. So one factor of it was that the police, local police, did not allow this until like minutes. And it was also the psychologists who wanted this surprise to happen without the consent. This was ethically wrong. However, this was the breach of the ethics Zimbardo's own contract the participant had signed. Participants playing the role of prisoners were not protected from psychological harm, experiencing incidents of humiliation and distress. So these, although physical violence were not permitted, psychological abuse, psychological harm, all these they should have been consented, but all these were not included. They were not protected. The prisoners were not protected from psychological harm. Experiencing incidents of humiliation, distress, cleaning toilets with their own hands, push-ups, guards being very cruel to them. One prisoner had to be released after 36 hours because of uncontrollable bursts of screaming, crying, and anger. There was total mental, psychological breakdown. However, in Zimbardo's defense, the emotional distress experienced by the prisoners could not have been predicted from the outset. So they didn't know how this will turn out. They didn't know that this prison experiment would be this real. Approval of the study was given by the Office of Naval Research, the Psychological Department of the University Committee of Human Experimentation. So the approval came, but the effects were devastating. I wanna take a break at this point, and in this week, this lecture and this lecture here. But these experiments that I showed shows different kinds of study. So the first study that I shared was the bystander effect with the murder of Kitty Genovese. This asserted that if there are other bystanders in this experiment murder case, if there another person is being murdered and there are many bystanders, it's most likely that person will not act in a right way. Conformity experiment, people are more readily likely to be conformed. Bobo experiment, violence, social learning, Bandura's social learning theory, and then the Stanford prison experiment that I just shared. These two studies show how how people are readily likely to conform, and that this prison experiment showed especially that people are readily willing to conform into social roles, such as a guard or prisoner or prison warden, to a fact that Zimbardo even said he didn't know that he was a social psychologist or scientist anymore. He thought he was a prison warden. people are more likely, very likely to obey, to be obedient, to be cruel, to adapt into their social roles. This was one of the findings of the Stanford prison experiment. All these researches, all these experiments were done scientifically, in a scientific method. Again, reviewing the scientific method, we ask a question. Why and the how, right? We ask the question. We form a hypothesis, and then we experiment. You observe and record the experiment, collect data, and we draw conclusions from that. These are a scientific method that apply to these kind of experiments, and this is the reason why we have a better knowledge of how human behavior and human sociology works. Thus, studying sociology as a social science is important, and we have covered some experiments, many experiments in this section. In the next section, we will continue on with 2 other experiments, and also we will take a look at different introductions and the foundations of sociology. We covered the scientific method according to Emil Durkheim.